So continuing down the carcass, this is the sirloin, top sirloin in specific. It comes from kind of the hip area of the animal. And as we move down the carcass, we'll always notice a decrease in fatness. So the chuck is the fattest primal, and subprimals from it have the greatest amount of fat. As we move from the rib to the loin, which is the lower back, into the hip of the animal, we start getting very lean. So a lot of people who have reservations about beef due to a nutritional standpoint, if they just don't want to consume the fat, and beef fat really has a neutral or even positive impact on your health, but it's still not exactly the most appealing thing to have a steak covered in fat. So really the muscles from the hip and leg of the animal that are responsible for propelling the animal through its movement are generally a lot leaner, but with that leanness comes some challenges in terms of tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. So the sirloin is generally known as kind of the middle ground of all of it. It's not as lean and has more flavor than the round, but it's not quite as high quality and tender as the rib and loin. So the sirloin is always our kind of middle ground and our middle dollar value as well. This subprimal here was $55, but we always see sirloin steaks on restaurant menus as our kind of lower dollar alternative to a ribeye steak or tenderloin steak. Still good quality. Many consumers, if you feed them a sirloin steak, wouldn't object at all. It's about 40th in terms of tenderness on our ranking from 1 to 160. We only measured 160 muscles in the beef carcass because some of them are so small. The ranking on it is kind of middle ground as well. So I always say that the sirloin is our middle ground muscles and our middle ground steaks. That being said, though, one of my favorite cuts of beef is actually from this sirloin. The sirloin has 3 different parts to it. This sirloin cap, which is my second favorite muscle in the entire beef carcass. The sirloin center, which is this inside portion where you would generally get sirloin steaks for a food service menu, or at retail you would get sirloin steaks from this center portion. And then what we call the mouse meat, and that's a silly name for it, I know. But like I said, this is my second favorite muscle in the entire beef carcass, and the reason that it is one of my favorites is because it is so flavorful. It has great, great beef flavor. It's not the most tender, doesn't have the most marbling, so our beef fat flavor is moderate, but the beef flavor that it has in it is exceptional. So when I'm looking at this guy, historically we would take 1-inch cross sections from this face into sirloin steaks. That's historically how sirloin steaks were cut. But if I had a 1-inch steak that was this big, it's as big as your head and really bigger than most dinner plates. So our theory here is to break this apart into its 3 sections and create 3 different useful pieces. Our first section that I'm going to break off is actually this ribeye cap. So once again, these fat seams that are between the muscles, all it takes is a little bit of pulling to expose those. And once we've exposed them, we just run our knife very gently through the fat and connective tissue there. Oop. Open this guy up. This muscle is a triangular shaped muscle, so once I find the end of the triangle, I'm just going to stop pulling on this muscle seam and cut straight through that exterior fat to get it completely removed. All right, I think I found it there. So cut straight down. My triangular muscle. I'll clean it up a little bit just to remove some of this fat. This is just exterior fat from the carcass. This fat generally doesn't impart flavor, but this is the one cut that I always say leave the fat cap on. Other names for this mussel include the culotte and picanha. Those are Central and South American names for this mussel. This mussel is like a delicacy there. They actually will pay more for this mussel than they will pay for any other mussel in the entire beef carcass. And if you go to, Brazilian style steakhouses like Fogo de Chao or Texas de Brazil, this is their main sirloin steak that they roast up and sell. So I just removed a sheet of connective tissue off of this point, and I'll clean up this side as well. But the exterior fat on the outside I always leave on, at least for the roasting portion. I will cut it down to about 1/4 of an inch exterior fat though, because we don't need much more than that. All of the extra is just excess at that point and unnecessary. But this fat cap, when roasted, so I would roast it fat side up, and this fat cap would just drip juice into the mussel. In those Texas or Brazilian style restaurants, they cut them into portions like this, fold them in a C, place a skewer through them, and then roast them on a little spit. And then they bring these little C-shaped beef pieces to your table, and they carve off little slices as necessary. So that's what this mussel is. One of my favorites. I like to roast it whole, but you can also slice it into steaks. So a 1-inch thick top sirloin cap steak, I'll trim the fat to an acceptable 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch. Looks kind of like a mini strip loin steak. So smaller portion sizes than a strip loin steak. Will have a more intense beefy flavor, less of that buttery beef fat flavor, but good as a steak as well. I just prefer it roasted, personally. One of my favorites. So I could cut this whole thing into steaks. One of the benefits to taking it off before cutting it into steaks is, as it was set on here, if I would have cut this entire sirloin into steaks, I would have been cutting it with the grain, which doesn't help tenderness at all. But once I start pulling it apart, and once I remove it from this top sirloin piece, I can then find the muscle fiber grain and then cut against it. So that will increase quality of these and help the steaks perform better when you eat them. But like I said, I prefer it roasted. So cutting them all into steaks is kind of taboo for me. I could roast these up and eat them every day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and probably not have too much of a problem. But wonderful, wonderful dry heat roast. Okay, so then we have this mouse mussel across this outside. There's actually 2 mussels of interest here. And once again, they're separated from that center sirloin by a fat seam. So I will go ahead and find the fat seam and start taking this off. Unfortunately, this mouse mussel really has very little use in the culinary world just because it's so small and so full of connective tissue. This outer muscle of the mouse meat has connective tissue fibers running all the way through it, and they're very thick. We've tried to grill it before, and the flavor's not terrible, but the connective tissue pieces within it just make it impossible to chew through. So that's unfortunate. There is one muscle on this inside portion, and I could separate it for you, but it's kind of long and skinny. This piece, if taken out and that connective tissue is removed, actually eats pretty well. The connective tissue on this piece is all outside of the muscle rather than within the muscle. So since it's outside, we can take it off before we cook it, and then we no longer have a connective tissue issue. We can take this outside portion off, cook it. It's a very lean, very, very lean cut, one of the leanest muscles in the beef carcass, and that just means that it has no marbling. So its flavor is very beefy, not very buttery, not the most juicy cut, so medium rare degree of doneness really is as far as we would want to take this guy in terms of how hot we cook it, but offers another good opportunity for something that could be, slice for a steak salad or something for your students. We're finally to our sirloin center. We call it a sirloin center or the center cut sirloin. All that means is that it's one muscle and that it was the center in between the two outside portions. I'm going to clean up all of this exterior fat. There's also some connective tissue here. So I said that this was part of the hip of the animal, and this is actually the skin of the bone of the hip bone. So very heavy connective tissue, not great to eat, so I'm going to go ahead and take that off as good as possible there. This outside fat really doesn't lend itself to us for any, usable reason. This outside fat could be left on and you could cut steaks out of it. Since the sirloin provides such a good nutritional message anyway, because it is a lean cut of beef, personally, I would rather take it off. Our other motivation for cutting our steaks this way is to create fillet-shaped or round-shaped, acceptable serving size beef cuts. So the more round and the more fillet-shaped we can get them, the better they'll look on the plate, the better they'll perform for consumers. So I'm going to take all of this exterior fat off. There is also a thin sheet of connective tissue on this guy, on this top portion. So as I get down to that, most of it is just fat that's not really grounded to the meat in any way, so I can just skim it off the top. But right here, there is a little bit of connective tissue. It's also a little bit of an irregularly shaped muscle. So as I cut it off of this, it kind of pooches out on this way, sucks in here. So just following the muscle is a little bit of a challenge sometimes, but it's easily overcome. Okay, so connective tissue. Once we have this all removed, we're ready to cut steaks out of this product. There's always a little bit of fat on this end. I don't have to take it off. This is right where we removed that sirloin cap or culotte. So it's seam fat rather than external fat. It's a little bit softer, cooks down in the cooking process a little bit better. So that fat on this corner is something that I'm less worried about removing. But you can remove it all the way down to the muscle if you would like. So I'm going to leave a little bit on this side. It's just a personal preference. For me, it's less of a yield issue. So then once we look at this muscle, we can kind of see that the muscle fibers are running in two different directions, separated by this seam. And this isn't a seam that we can pull apart and rip apart. It's a seam that actually just has connective tissue in it. These are the same muscle, it's just separated by this seam. These muscle fibers are running in a diagonal direction, and these muscle fibers are running in a vertical direction. So what I'm going to do in order to cut these steaks both across the grain is actually cut along this connective tissue all the way through this product. And that will allow me to cut one side against the grain and the other side perfectly against the grain to maximize tenderness. That's something that we're kind of worried about in the sirloin because it's not one of the most tender areas of the carcass. So the more we can maximize tenderness, the better. This is really heavy connective tissue as well. This is a tendon that holds this muscle to bone. So it's very, very thick. That's the connective tissue that we were following in order to split these two portions apart. So the more I can remove of that connective tissue here where it's really, really thick, the better. Then we can start cutting steaks, and we really can take this to the next level and have a good quality eating experience for consumers without connective tissue in the steak. One of the best things about sirloin steaks is that they're so versatile in terms of portion size. So if you ever look on a menu, Ribeye steaks are generally like 12 to 16 to 20 ounces. Top sirloin steaks, you'll find them all the way from 4 ounces to 20 ounce steaks. And the reason they can do that is they can cut 4 ounce to 6 to even 8 ounce steaks out of this thinner log, and then they'll cut their bigger steaks out of this guy. So if we cut a 1-inch thick steak off of here, pretty good sized steak, probably 10 ounces, but this guy would be 6 to maybe 4, probably 6. I like the shape of it better. If we're talking about that really round, nice fillet shape, these are called top sirloin fillets because they do have the fillet shape. To me, this is a better eating experience. Consumers in the United States are kind of obsessed with round shapes and thick cut steaks. So I can make these thin steaks at 6 ounces, or I can make a nice 2-inch thick fillet at 12 ounces, all in one fell swoop with these guys. Since I like them, I prefer my steaks to be kind of like this, and I don't know, I just think that they look a little bit nicer when they're round. I actually cut this thicker portion in half and then cut more steaks off of this that are semi-round and thick steaks. They do have a little bit of a square corner here, but during the cooking process they really tend to round out and be nice and round. These look excellent with bacon wrapped around them as well. So anything that you would do with a fillet, you can also do with these top sirloin fillets. They're very, very versatile, just not as tender as a filet mignon, but same shape. Sold at a lower dollar value generally at food service, but they're would be great to use in the classroom, as even if you cut these 1-inch thick steaks, you would really make your dollar go really far and actually have a steak for almost everybody in the classroom. Another thing that we suggest to food service operators with this sirloin is a sirloin petite roast. So this is a roast that would be rubbed and then dry cooked. Looks awesome on a carving station. So if we were to cook this up and then slice it really thin across the grain, it would be an awesome, sliced roast beef for sliders or something like that. So there are so many versatile ways to use the top sirloin and to have a very good eating experience. For classrooms, it provides the opportunity to have a lot of steaks that are very similar in eating experience and in value, at a very low dollar value.